Right, this is RetroCultCast, and I'm Jason Carney. I teach popular literature at Christopher Newport University, and I'm joined here with my friend Cal. Do you want to introduce yourself, Cal?
Sure. Dr. Cal Baldari. I teach philosophy and ethics for the Virginia Community College System. Um,
That's is that it? Yeah,
I
that's
can
great.
go,
Okay.
I can go
No,
into like the full blown thing, but I think after a few of these, you
I
probably
know people know who
get.
we are at this point. I probably don't have to introduce ourselves moving forward, but uh, so yeah, we just thought we would start doing this again. There's been a lot of time in between episodes. I watched Doctor Strange a couple nights ago and wanted to talk to Cal about the tension between science and mysticism, and not just as it relates to the film, but like the general topic. And I was like, well, we should do a podcast on that. So hence this meeting. Cal, you watched Doctor? Did you rewatch Doctor Strange?
Yeah, enough to get a handle on it. Unfortunately, I've seen all of them so many times that it's like can't really enjoy sitting down and watching it.
Yeah,
So basically, I had to sit there and take notes and all that stuff. That
yeah, yeah.
was more of a study than it was sitting down and enjoying a film.
Is in the
But
background. So,
yeah,
um, yeah, so yeah, that was the first time I've seen it, so it's fresh for me. I mean, I'd read a couple comic books issues here and there, and when you read the comic book issues, they don't spend a lot of time on the background. You usually dropped into the middle of a story. So I just had a general. Oh, and I also another connection I have with Doctor Strange was there was a collectible card game called Overpower in the late '90s, and I had the Doctor Strange character in the cards, and he was a badass in that game, and I remember that. Um, but that's my Doctor Strange connection. Read a couple of the issues, and then watched this film. So
I guess if I were to give a connection kind of thing,
mhm.
so Strange is one of my more appreciated, I guess,
Mhm.
individual, like non-team based uh, heroes within the Marvel universe.
Mhm.
Um, I like the MCU version in particular, but as an entity within the grander Marvel um, multiverse, if you will,
Mhm.
there's a there's always been kind of an interest in how magic and superpowers work together, and um, like the versatility of magic. Like why doesn't magic just dominate in all of comic books at that point?
Yeah.
But yeah, so for Strange, like I really enjoy the idea of having a mage
Mhm.
within this more urban superheroic setting, and trying to find out like how do you mix supernatural with super science and play with that kind of stuff. But yeah,
It's interesting. You said use the term urban, and people talk about urban fantasy as a genre,
hmm
and usually that's Harry Potter, right? This is a kind of urban fantasy. Doctor Strange is a kind of urban fantasy. I, you know,
sure.
I, yeah. I mean,
Well, I kind of
uh,
go ahead.
no, it's because I think of it as like a superhero film. It's a comic book movie, there are a couple of shots that reminded me of I can't remember the title of it, but the Harry Potter universe movie based in New York, um, Monsters and Where to Find Them. What's it called?
Yeah,
I forget what it's called, but there are a couple of scenes where he's in the sanctum in Greenwich Village, and he's wandering around, and he's there's wizards fighting each other in the streets in the mirror world. It's like this could have been right out of like a Harry Potter novel. So
right. Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that you mentioned Harry Potter as urban fantasy because that's oddly enough not the first thing that I normally think of. Because I tend to think of urban fantasy as monster stuff, right? So
hmm.
modern era werewolf stuff and modern like underworld and Blade and like
Ooh.
these kinds of more like less superhero, more monsters, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Especially when you're talking about literature as opposed to like cinema and stuff like that. I
Hmm.
think urban fantasy is definitely more of a literary genre when you start separating things than it is a cinematic genre.
Mm-hmm.
Though I'm sure it could apply, especially if you have somebody that's more of a filmophile than I am.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I always thought about like urban fantasy versus gateway fantasy and secondary world fantasy. So gateway fantasy is the most simple, where you have like the Fey world and the real world, and there's some sort of apparatus that allows the real world to go into the Fey.
Mm-hmm.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then
Right.
secondary world fantasy it's all fantasy, and then urban fantasy is where like they're overlapped, and sometimes the overlap is in such a way that like the fantastical elements are hidden. Like normal people, like Muggles, don't know that there's a fantastic realm. But other times you have urban fantasies where it's like Shadowrun, where you know the trolls are just right there. Like they're basically a troll can just be like the guy at the government building, but
Right.
but
when you start including any kind of magical element, it does sort of open that door, doesn't it? Like
mm-hmm.
a superhero like the Hulk, right? If you do a movie about the Hulk, from a particular perspective, that's a monster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wouldn't be weird for somebody who just got off of the spaceship to sit down and watch the Hulk and be like, "Wow, that's a crazy monster movie,"
mm-hmm.
right? Like they don't know anything about comic books or anything about superheroes or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
This is a monster movie, and oh hey, look, the monster does well. Like he comes to the good. Yay! That's a great story. Let's watch Frankenstein next. It kind of is a similar sort of feel, but the minute that you start including magic as a thing and calling it magic,
mm-hmm.
well, now like you can't shut the door on that. It's there. So interesting stuff.
You mentioned the Hulk, and by the way, I've been reading the Incredible Hulk new version or whatever it is. I'm not sure what the appropriate term is for it, but like the storyline going on right now, and it's like it's really playing into the supernatural. Like the Hulk is constantly fighting like monsters and demons and ghosts and stuff. But what's interesting is I always thought that the Hulk was like a scientific aberration. Like he's like Bruce Banner is, isn't he like he's radiated by isn't it gamma rays? Aren't they gamma rays that turn him into the Hulk? So it's like it's kind of like within the realm of science, and I think that distinction between science and magic seems to be really important for the Marvel universe for some reason. Like it's important that the Hulk is, he was this scientific aberration that now they're trying to frame as more of an actual bona fide monster, like, in these new stories where, Doctor Strange is not just a mutant. He's a practitioner of the occult arts. You know what I mean? But
yeah, so that's one of the things I like about Strange, right? Is very similar to things that I like about characters like Batman or Tony Stark or any of these kinds of incredibly intelligent characters, right? Like it seems like the comic book world doesn't like classifying intelligence as a superpower unless it's the bad guy, right? The minute that you've got some kind of mastermind, well, now they've got super intelligence, and that's why they're evil, right? Because the intelligentsia and the intellectual elite and all of this, can't have your intellectual elite being the head of the superhero guild, right? Mm-hmm. So I always thought that was kind of interesting that this is a genius level character, not a super intelligent character. It's like the dude created his own element.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. This guy learned all the powers of a master magician in the span of like less than a year, right? So like all these other people have been training for years and years and years. And here he walks in and he's stealing books out of the library and doing all kinds of crazy stuff because he's got a photograph. I doubt he's the first mage with a photographic memory, right? And they say it right there in the show. Like, it's like photographic memory isn't enough. There's something else going on here. And I always thought that was like, yes, there is something. The dude's super intelligent. You can whether that you want to call that a mutant power, whether you want to call it something else, whatever. The dude is super intelligent. Batman is super intelligent. He is the absolute best detective of all time. You've got Tony Stark is the absolute best engineer of all time. Like, these guys are way beyond the greatest of what we know in this world in any kind of practical term. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a random aside, no. I do think it's interesting that Strange learned his superpowers. Mm-hmm. He's not like, as far as the MCU is concerned, or the Marvel universe, he's not super intelligent. Mm-hmm. He's just really, really smart, right? He's just a smart guy. Like, I could be that smart. You could be that smart. Everybody could be that smart. But he's just really smart, right? Yeah. But he learns all of this magecraft in a year or less, right? And all of a sudden, like, hey, by the way, here's a sanctum. The dude died. Yeah. It's yours now. But
I know he's like the the rookie for, like, and I don't want to criticize the movie too much, because I enjoyed the movie and I managed my expectations. It's a comic book movie. I'm not gonna, but like the pace by which he became Doctor Strange, the character, like, 1 second he's this, incredulous surgeon, won't believe any of this magic stuff, and the next thing you know, he's like, you get a phone call, and the next thing you know, oh, it's okay, he's like, believing in chakras and studying, like, ancient, sorceress texts, and is a master of them. Like, it happens so fast,
Yeah, I do think there's some time lapse there, but that being said, I mean, you're right, because he's really flipping smart.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm happy to credit him with that. And if we want to say that his intelligence is a superpower, great. Mm-hmm. But his magic isn't. His magic can be learned. Mm-hmm. And as evident by all the people in the place, it can be learned by anybody. So, at what point superpower has become so diluted because everybody's running around doing magic-y stuff?
I want to say something about the the way that intelligence often becomes, like, raw intelligence becomes like a villainous trait. I was thinking of, like, in DC, Lex Luthor,
mm-hmm.
Like, and then also, like, sometimes having mind power, like, doesn't necessarily equate into intelligence. Like, I think sometimes if there's mind power in, like, these comic book stories, mind power becomes like psychic power. Like Professor X, like, he's quote unquote so intelligent. His brain is so powerful that he's able to do these things, with his brain. Like the same with Jean Grey.
But I think, like, even in the comic book world, mm-hmm. they make that distinction. Like, they're happy to say he's both very smart and a very powerful psychic.
Okay.
Right? And I think that's fair, because, I mean, Jean Grey is not that smart, and she's a super powerful psychic. So that's not a requirement. They're, I wouldn't say they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Maybe there is a way to apply intelligence to how you use your powers. In fact, I'd guarantee it, right? If I had super strength, like, that's not going to suddenly become my most dominant drive towards mm-hmm. everything. It's not about crushing everything all of a sudden. No, I'm still going to apply logic and all the things I do in the day-to-day now. Mm-hmm. But some things will just be a lot easier than they were before,
Yeah, I mean, you have some characters who have superpowers that you kind of forget they have, like Beast. Like, he's mm-hmm. like a super powerful warrior. Like, he's physically capable, but it's his intelligence that. I was thinking, because, like, you have the spectrum in the Marvel universe of, like, technology and science on the one hand, and Doctor Strange is like magic on the other. But also, like, you have the mutants and specifically psychics. Like, is Professor X a sorcerer? Is Jean Grey, like, a sorcerer? Like, are the mutants in, like, a completely different? I know this is, like, really nerdy. Like, where do they fall on the spectrum of magic versus science? Is there a science of like is psychic ability just like neuroscience? Like, are they just, like, do they have just really powerful brains that can kind of project emotions and use telekinesis and like, could you explain Professor X's abilities from like a neuroanatomical perspective. Because if you could, then they're like different than what Doctor Strange is doing. Doctor Strange is like, you know, anything that he can do has nothing to do with science. I think they make a point of kind of making that distinction in the movie. You know?
Now I have thoughts on this, expansive thoughts, mostly due to role playing, more so than comic books and movies. But I'm curious where you go with this. Where do you lead off to that? Like, do you think that they're the same? Do you think it's something that can be learned, or that it's something that can be mastered through intelligence?
I don't know. I mean, this is a point where Clark's law becomes really useful. You know, like any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and I feel like basically like we're talking about like a serious metaphysical distinction here. Like, you know, no, from a metaphysical point of view, you can make a distinction between like actual magic, which is not predictable. It's outside of the realm of like matter, right?
Okay.
Versus, you know, it's like it's not a technology if you're doing like a, you know, what's in ritual magic, they I'm sorry, traditional magic, they have the concept of what's it called, where, you know, if you have like a voodoo doll and it's shaped like a certain person, and you what's it called?
Sympathetic.
Yes, sympathy, right? So this concept of sympathy, which is not just in Western magic, but it's ubiquitous in a lot of magic. Like there are connections between things that are similar, right? Like that's not if you know, the metaphysical distinction is that's not, there's no scientific basis to that. Like it's operating on using laws that are not recognizable to science at all, right? So I think Clark's law wants to collapse it all. Well, really, that sympathetic magic is just there are scientific laws that you just don't have access to, right? I don't like that idea. I like the idea that there's actually two, you know, like there's this firm metaphysical distinction between like, you know, a power that you might get from a mutation, you know, in your brain versus actually being able to use like a esoteric occult, you know, I don't know if that makes any sense, spell. Right? What do you think of that?
I mean, it's interesting. Mostly
I'm splitting hairs, but I think it's an important. Yeah.
But that's the thing. I think that with this sort of thing, in order to keep it straight, you have to split hairs, right? Because you can have a character that is magic and super strong. They're just using magic to do it. You can have a character that's super powered and super strong. They're just using superpowers to do it. You can have someone that's psychic and super strong. They're just using telekinesis to do it. Like, there's lots of ways to be super strong, but how they do it is important when you start talking about things like, you know, where's the power come from, right? So I see the distinction as being, so there's 6 degrees, of which 2 of them are close enough that I wouldn't die on that particular hill. But there are at least 5 distinctive power types, if you will, right? If you're talking about from a literary perspective or from a cinematic perspective, if I'm writing a story, I need to have a system that delineates these 5 things from the natural world, right? So the natural world is the natural world. I can go outside, it's the natural world. It's something that I can do given enough patience, enough money, enough time, all those other kinds of stuff. If I can do it, then it doesn't count as super anything. It's just, I can do it, right? So like when people talk about wealthy characters having the wealth, that's not wealthy, right? We have people right now in the world who are very wealthy and don't do superpower stuff. Just assholes, most of them. But
they probably want to, but they can't.
I guess never can tell. I'm sure it's been the downfall of many. But that's it. Like there's things that can happen in the real world that, you know, I can be a Black Widow like character, right? I can be someone that's highly trained in, you know, martial arts and assassination techniques and interrogation and all. Like I can do that. the fact that she's on a superhero team is kind of on accident almost.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ton of characters that could just take her space.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike Hawkeye, whose accuracy is preternatural, right? So even though all the other stuff about him is pretty mundane, that ability with the bow, while trained, like he did train with it for a long time, but his accuracy has become superpowered, meaning the training kind of either awoke something or something like that, right? So putting that to the side, I think the first and the largest category, mostly because of things like fantasy literature. So you've got comic books, you've got urban fantasy, you've got sci-fi, you've got cyberpunk, you've got all these things, and you've got fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like it can't be fantasy unless you throw in some magic, right? Like it becomes something else. It's historical fiction or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to have that little magical element. Even if it's just tangential, it's got to be there. So we've got an entire genre that doesn't play with any of these other tropes. You just got the one power system, and defining that power system is the key to that story, that world, all that world building. So you got magic. Mm-hmm. But magic isn't that simple either, right? Because you've got magic, like Doctor Strange magic, but then you've also got prophets and divine agents, and in some situations you've got priests that can cast spells and various other kinds of holy powers. So you've got this divine kind of thing going on, mm-hmm. where you're not really casting spells, right? It has nothing to do with you. You're channeling, or you're begging for intervention, or any of these others. So you got this kind of miracle. So like depending on the world that you're talking about, miracles or divine magic or any of these kinds of things aren't based on the person that's casting them, right? They're just kind of there.
They're channeling the power from a greater power,
right? And I do think that's interesting. I think talking about the divine when we talk about magic it's a tangent, and I don't want to get into it right now, but mm-hmm. I do think it's a kind of interesting thing because I don't want to get into it right now. So we get divine, right?
I just say, not to get into it, but there are a lot of sword and sorcery texts that don't make a distinction between, like, a sorcerer who is, their power comes from a demon they've summoned. And so they're effectively, it's a kind of divine magic, right? Except for it's not their power. What they've done is they've incarcerated a power and they're kind of channeling it, right? Versus like ritual magic, where like because of some knowledge you have, some ritual you have access to, or some practice, you're able to make effects. I think that's an important distinction. But
yeah, and so I would include any of that. You call it channel magic, whatever you want to call it. But any kind of magic where you're not the source of it, mm-hmm. right? Maybe, there can be combinations, right? Just like you said, you can have a sorcerer who ritually summoned an entity and is now channeling mm-hmm. their power. So they've got both this knowledge of magic and this channeled power to increase their power. So that's pretty common too, right? But mm-hmm. in the grand scheme of things, we would always come back to the fact that both of these things, whether we're talking about religious texts in real life, fantasy texts, modern texts that include all of that stuff, those things are commonly put together as magic, mm-hmm. right? So then we have like kind of the next category, which is fairly singular, and you kind of talked about this, right? These are mental powers, psionics, psychic powers, whatever you want to call it. The interesting thing about psychic powers, I think, is that they are, regardless of how similar they are to magic or how similar they are to other kinds of powers, they're always this mental ability. Now, how you focus that kind of thing is part of your world building, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing that makes psionics different from both either magic or any other kind of powers is that we can, based on a little bit of suspension of disbelief, we can kind of imagine psionics as real, right? So you got your spoon benders and your levitators and all these other kinds of things that are doing more than just show magic, right? And you got to wonder, like, how are they doing that? Is it a trick? Is it a show? So there's this aura of possibility that comes with psionic powers because they are purely mental. And
I think that arguably something like psychic powers exist. Like, I mean, I'm not putting my tinfoil hat on. I'm not being crazy, but like, I read this uh, biography of this martial artist, Josh Waitzkin. I won't get off the topic of psionics, but like real psionics. He's talking about how like there's certain moves in martial arts that like if you practice them over and over and you break them down to their constituent parts and you really like channel the muscles, you can start to do things that from the point of view of your opponent, from your opponent's point of view, appears supernatural. Like he talks about how when he first met his one of his masters in this martial art that he was studying, he was thrown and he didn't know where it came from. It was almost like one minute he's standing and the next minute he's on the ground, and he's like, it felt like magic, but it was because of just like it was purely physiological and kind of the mental practice of like this martial arts, but like from the point of view of him not knowing what was going on behind the scenes, like, and I think salesmen do that to you sometimes. Like if you have a really good salesman or politician, right? Like anyone super charismatic person, like they're not like making your eyes do the spirally thing, but there are some really intriguing ways that people can like there are all these like psychic practices that people talk about, like that I'm trying to think of a good example, like hypnosis. There's a handbook on how to disrupt bureaucratic meetings. I don't know, it's a kind of like there's this like it's on the I forget what it's called, but there's this handbook on how to kind of institutional sabotage. You can engage. There's certain sorts of interventions in a conversation that you can in a meeting that you can kind of cause institutional sabotage just by offering an objection. But anyhow, I feel like psychic powers. This is kind of a tangent, but when you say psychic powers are unique in that we can believe in them in a way we can't believe in magic, right? I completely agree, and I'm already thinking about like it's not as dramatic as like exploding something with your brain, but we can kind of imagine a really smart person, a person with a very powerful brain achieving intriguing effects.
Yeah, and I don't think it requires intelligence, though. Intelligence, like we were talking about before, intelligence could definitely come into play, but I don't think that that's necessary. I think that willpower probably is a lot more, self-discipline is a lot more important. Like, for instance, you're talking about the martial artist. Now, I kind of allow for martial arts magic to be magic, right? But
the Hadoken,
what's that?
Is the Hadoken just a symbol of like Ryu's like martial arts prowess, or is he actually shooting spiritual energy out of his hands?
So that's channeling. I mean, it's pure channeling.
Okay.
In most video games and like that kind of genre of literature, it's just magic.
Okay.
Magic with a different color.
I feel like in Baki, it's actually like they go out of their way to try to make it seem like it's just super training. Like
sure. But can you imagine a normal person doing that?
No.
You can't imagine a normal person doing that. Then, and by normal I mean existent, like someone who has ever existed. If you can imagine them doing that, then training might be something that you can talk about. Yeah. But if it's beyond, like, there are scenes in Baki where people get beat literally to death, and then like stand back up, like, all right, ready for round two. It's like, no, you're dead. Go away. So I just, that's fine. I just kind of throw that in there with magic, though it is fundamentally different, right? The reason I don't like talking about martial arts powers and psychic powers in the same kind of pool is that while it does take a kind of spiritual balance or a kind of a mental will and self-control, self-discipline, that's not what's doing it, right? That's not what is creating the effect. The effect is this magic, this adept style, the ability to channel magic through our own bodies to make our bodies do things, right? So like it's one of the ways that you can be superpowered. You can be super strong. You can be super strong because you channel your magic into your body. Blah blah blah. So not quite the same thing. They use the term spiritual, but it's because in like the way that Eastern thought about magic and Western thought about magic, it's different, right? We've had a couple hundred years to have the two genres mix quite a bit, and there's a lot more similarities than differences, but they are different. But that said, back to psi. Psi is, I think, because we don't understand the brain as much as we think we should, having had one our whole existence. I think it makes it easier to imagine that somebody can like take alpha waves or take brain power and accomplish feats in the world. And like you said, there are interesting stories, like women who are sitting in their kitchen and suddenly hear a scream, and you find out that like their daughter, their adult daughter in New York, just got murdered or whatever. Like these horrible kinds of things, but the anecdotal evidence is pretty extensive. It's hard to say, like, how did these 19 people on this particular event, all from different walks of life, from different places, all have the exact same experience? It seems weird, right? So it's like, well, maybe there's something to that. And since those types of things tend to manifest as knowledge or as intuitions or as feelings, even as little glimpses of the future, right? All that kind of stuff. Because of that, we can kind of attribute that to some kind of brain type power. It's nothing to do with intelligence, but it does have to do with the strength and the force that the brain can bring to bear, the energy of the brain, if you will. So psionics is distinctive from magic in that way, right? Now you might have worlds, fantasy worlds, where magic is driven in a similar sort of way. Like I think you could, from in the very early parts of the movie, if you stopped watching Doctor Strange before he starts talking to Wong, you can sort of imagine like, oh, this language is magic. Like the language is spells, and by speaking the language, we're able to manifest magic in the world. Well, sure, okay, that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty psychic, right? I'm using foci in order to make my brain do things to the world, or make my will real in the world. But then all of a sudden you've got magic items, you've got spells that don't require any kind of verbalization; they're just gestures. Some spells are rituals that require lots of people. Why? That doesn't. Who knows, right? So I think that having the psi as this purely singular, non-ritualistic, non-learned, right? You can't learn to be psychic. It's something that you acquire, even if it's just a one-off, right? Super intuition, or flipping the car off of your child that's just been in a car wreck, that kind of thing. We can imagine, right? So then we get into superpowers, right? And superpowers are great because you don't have to define diddly shit. Like you're just like, dude can teleport. How? Who cares? He's a mutant, huh?
If you use that term mutant, then that means that apparently in the human genome there are potential, versions of the human that can do that, or maybe like I'm not a biologist, but like there's something out in nature that can do this thing. You know what I mean? Like, so I feel like with particularly with like the X-Men universe, like they use that word mutant, and I'm like, okay, well, it's not like in Warhammer Fantasy, you have people who are mutated by the forces of chaos, and they have like the stigmata of chaos, like eyes on their chest and stuff, and like tentacles. But that's clearly like a magic. You know what I mean? Like they're not that kind of like, they're not chaos mutants. These are mutants, and so I think that it's superpowers in the X-Men universe is explainable. And then in DC, like Superman is just he's he's an alien. He has alien powers. He's being in Earth's atmosphere, I think, is the justification for his powers. But then there are some superheroes in the Marvel universe that are just like they were born that way, or they. But there's always some origin story for their powers. Like Spider-Man, I think. Didn't Spider-Man in the earliest comics, the web is actually like a device that he creates. Like it's
always has been. It has always been a device until the Spider-Man movies.
Tobey Maguire movie. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's because of his body horror fetish that I think that it went that way. I actually kind of liked it. I thought it was cool. Yeah. Like, why wouldn't he? Like, he's got all these other kinds of abilities. Why wouldn't he have the spinnerets?
Yeah.
The fact that he has them on his wrist is a little weird, right? Because like, where does the spinners come? Where does spider webs come from? Like, we don't want that Spider-Man.
Hey, is Scarlet Witch? I've never seen that show. I should watch it. Maybe that could be our next thing. Is she a sorceress? Like this? Is she in the same kind of realm as Doctor Strange?
Let's cross that bridge later, because it's its own. We would have an entire conversation on that.
Oh, okay.
She is technically a mutant.
So okay, I need to watch. Because Storm clearly is like a storm god, but she's a mutant. You know what I mean? Like she behaves like a god. In her.
Right. And, so her whole thing with the god is that it is just a person who actually took a few minutes to think about what would happen if somebody was an actual mutant among people that aren't mutants.
Yeah.
Because what would happen right now if suddenly somebody was able to start summoning lightning, right? What would it be like right now if somebody could summon a toy car into their hand from nowhere without like any kind of weird
cool party trick?
But it'd be like it's unexplainable. We don't know how do you do that. I don't know. I just do it.
That show, My Hero Academia, all the people who have like a really crappy quirk, like always, like in that universe, there's like, oh, you can like you have a lighter on your thumb, like you can just make my quirk is that I can make one teeny tiny flame on my thumb, like people get used to it very quickly,
Yeah, so My Hero Academia is great because it takes the if everybody's super, then nobody is. Right? It just like it becomes weird to not have powers.
Yeah.
So now it's less about trying to explain how people's powers work and why they work the way that they do, and all. Now you got to explain why some people don't get them, and that's singular. You just got to focus on the one thing, and that's pretty great, right? But like the way that people get superpowers, you kind of touched on it already, is important. Because like there's people that are born with it. There's people who mutate later in life due to some externality, right? So it's not that they were like, for the most part, almost all, My Hero Academia being a pretty good example of a breach of this trope, but it happens at puberty. It's like this weird puberty thing. If you're a mutant and you get superpowers. Then there's the experiments, right? These are, or I should say, the superpower origin story event, right? Getting bit by a radioactive fire, getting blasted by gamma rays, being an alien that travels to Earth, all these kinds of things that can create superpowers, super serums, like all these things that can create superpowers.
I think the Captain America example, it brings up like how sometimes you can get superpowers because of like some sort of prosthetic device. Like without his super serum, he's just a normal person. The difference between Tony Stark and Captain America and and Captain America and Batman, Batman and Tony Stark are very similar. They both are really intelligent and they create all these devices that make them seem like they're superheroes. Captain America he's different. He's kind of like Batman and Iron Man, but he didn't create those things. So he's different. He's just had these. He's had science and intelligence and engineering applied to him. So he's kind of like
But I mean, it's super common. Like Captain America is a prime example, but it's really common, right? You've got the ones that did it to themselves, like Banner.
Okay.
Then you get the people that have had it done to them on purpose, like Captain America, and then you've had people that have had it happen to them on accident, Peter Parker. Like there's all kinds of externalities that can cause this stuff, and whether it be a drug or like you said, a prosthetic. Now there's an interesting kind of prosthetic when you start talking about cyborgs, right?
Yeah.
A true cyborg, we can kind of get behind that. We don't have the technology yet to actually fuse human to metal in that sort of way. But like it's not a huge leap. It's easier to believe in that being possible than even psychic powers, in my opinion. Right?
But you can have in current medical engineering, in defense of current biomedical engineering, you have like artificial heart valves that work. You have insulin pumps. There are actual cyborgs walking around right now. Some people who are epileptic will have like intracranial implants and stuff like that. Like there are real living cyborgs. But
yeah, the difference is
no
that, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just I think you were going to say what I'm going to say, which is that it doesn't make it. Those are correcting a problem, not necessarily like making us better.
Right? They're non-augmentations. Right?
Yeah.
Augmentations are what make cyborgs super. The minute that you can do something that you couldn't have done as a normal person, like somebody with a pacemaker lives instead of dies. That's what they can do. Right? Somebody with an artificial limb is able to move when normally they couldn't. So, there's a big difference between external prosthetics.
There's also accidental augmentation, though. I mean, I think that I have a friend who has a real-time what's it called, glycemic level indicator, right? Like, because he has diabetes, and to some extent you could think that's valuable information about one's, like you could instrumentalize that information and kind of be healthier if because that's an advantage to some extent. I'm saying like sometimes with our interventions to solve quote unquote problems, you end up augmenting somebody. Like I know there are some people with like prosthetic legs that they can run faster than people with biological legs because the legs are made out of a certain
that's kind of that's false.
Really?
A person who can run using a prosthetic leg faster than someone who doesn't run that fast happens all the time, right? In the same way that
I said that we're in agreement,
right? But the fastest human being versus the fastest human being with a prosthetic leg is going to be dramatically different. The fastest human being is going to be way faster.
You think so? I don't know the numbers, but
the natural ability is always going to trump as of right now because we just don't have that tech. But even things like information.
In the back of my mind, I swear I think there was a disabled Olympian who had these legs made of a certain material, and they propelled them so fast that they were like, this is faster than anybody could ever run. But I could be wrong. I think it would be fun to kind of look this up later. Yeah, not now. Yeah.
But I guarantee if we were to look at, I forget the name of the kid. He's a Virginian even. But there's a kid that just beat the world record for the 200 meter.
Oh, okay.
And like he's literally now the fastest human being in the world.
Crazy. That's cool.
To have ever lived. Well, or to have ever been measured, right? The fastest human being to have ever been measured. And like you can have spring-loaded titanium legs, but if you can't feel what's going on, you cannot respond in the same way that someone with natural legs can. Right? You're still using the same muscle power. You're getting that little spring back, but that can only do so much, right? And our feet can do that just fine. We do it all the time.
But the general point to tie a bow on this is that like sometimes when you are bringing in a prosthesis to fix or correct the problem, you can get this kind of accidental augmentation that happens.
I don't think we can. I don't think we can today. I think we can get things where people are better off than they were without it. It might be better off than like some people, but they'll never be better than someone who doesn't have a prosthetic at all. at their maximal, right? So the person who is the most healthy because they just naturally know what foods to eat and are like if they bite into something that will kind of mess up their blood sugar in such a way that it will cause problems, like it just tastes wrong. The same way that like people who are allergic can like they get it to hear and even just the smell and what like no thanks. I'm not going to do that because it's dangerous to me. So someone who is the most maximal capable of human beings are going to still be better off than someone who is augmented because of a deficiency, even though there's lots of people underneath both of them.
But if you define prestige, this is a potential. Let's
not do it because
I'm thinking like there are prostheses. If you start to define things like a smartphone as a prosthesis, right. Well, then clearly a person with a smartphone is much more capable at math.
I really don't want to do a philosophy of mind class in here.
Okay,
that's what this will turn into.
So
let's talking about the extended self. Anytime we have something that is external to us that is not literally a part of us that we can't get rid of,
is that part of mind?
Like for instance, these are corrective, but they're not prostheses.
Okay. Oh, okay. Right? See, I would call these prostheses.
They're not, right? Okay. A prosthesis is something that you need that is like a part of you, right? Mm-hmm. That without them, interesting cases of cyborgs are those cyborgs that are, it isn't a case of just pure human ingenuity, right? So I didn't design, like I'm a super smart, not super, I'm a very intelligent, let's put it that way. I'm a very intelligent engineer. And I figure out how to marry electronic signals to nerves and get them all to connect in exactly the right ways so that your metal arm or your prosthetic arm or whatever is now so much a part of you that it works in exactly the same way, right? So now everything that arm can do better than a natural arm is now an augmentation because it is a natural arm as far as your body is concerned. It feels like a natural arm because all of it is put together. So Bucky, right? The Winter Soldier, that his bionic arm is pure, right? It's a pure super science that's been added to this person. And that's the thing. Cyborgs of that type fall into super science, which I haven't gotten to yet. Whereas cyborgs like Cyborg in the DC universe, who is basically a marriage of the mother box and human entity, right, put together, that's something very different. Because that, yes, it is man-machine, but it's not man-machine engineering, it's man-machine magic. So superpowers, don't have to explain it, you just have it. As long as it's consistent within your world that there are superpowers, then you're fine. Like if you're in a world that is everything is magic except for this one guy who happens to be able to fly and shoot lasers out of his eyes, that's weird. But if everybody's got weird stuff going on, even if they're all different, that's okay, right? Because we've just accepted it as a genre. But that does lead to the fifth, which I think this one combines, depending on the era and the style of story, super science and weird science, right? So super science is that science that is unbelievable. Like it does magic stuff. The Iron Man suits can't do what Iron Man suits are shown to do, right? A person can't fit in those. There's no room for all the stuff that they do plus a person right off the bat. And then on top of that, you've got things like super AIs, you've got nanites, and not only nanites, but nanites that are differentiated and intelligent universally. That's pretty incredible.
This is the gray area. That's a boundary point, a boundary line separating hard science fiction and soft science fiction. Because in soft science fiction, you don't need to explain the science. You can just use some science sounding words, and okay, we accept it, right? Start the Star Trek jargon. You need to oscillate the emancipator or whatever. I don't know. To inject the I'm trying to think, carbon chamber with negative ionization capsules. I don't know. Just made that up. It justifies the technology. That's soft science, and then hard science, like something like Anthony Weir's The Martian. It's like, well, you actually have to think through how this would work, and if I think you're allowed to push the boundaries in hard science fiction, but just so, like, there's a certain contract that you can't violate. Where, like, an engineer, if they see you trying to say something about air pressure that wouldn't exist, they would throw the book across the room. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, and so the interesting thing about hard science fiction in particular is that you don't have superhero stories with hard science fiction. Mm-hmm. Superhero stories and magic stories and fantasy stories happen with soft science fiction because otherwise it doesn't work, right? Because you can't by definition you can't explain these things. Mm-hmm. But and like you have to take into account the weird science stuff too, right?
How is weird science different?
So that's the stuff that's like more alchemical, or it's like
Frankenstein,
alien, right? So like a ray gun from Buck Rogers, the original, back in the ray gun era and the rocket era, like those kinds of that's weird science. Like nobody even bothers sort of trying to explain those. Only that it is scientific, that a scientist is doing the work, right? Whereas with super science, you tend to see a little more like, Star Trek and space opera in general, where you at least bother with some pseudo science in there. You'll throw something in there.
Yeah.
Like
it's a spectrum between plausibility, like the complete implausible, you're just using science words to make it sound cool. That's weird science. If you're trying a little bit for some plausibility, it's super science. But if you're actually thinking through the science, I like that. We just made up a spectrum.
Yeah, and so I think you can kind of have them combined in a sort of way. For instance, Tony Stark, super science. If you go with the kind of more comic-based Whiplash from the second Iron Man movie, right? Whiplash was he was a weird scientist. Like, yes, they do the sciencey stuff, but the end result is just like, who cares if it works? Like, it just works. Mm-hmm. That's good enough. Like, this is.
I think Wakanda is borders on weird science, where it's almost like fantasy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the what's the element that they have that they
vibranium.
There you go. Yeah.
The fact that vibranium has like all these. Now, first off, of course, we have to be careful. Vibranium in the MCU and vibranium in the Marvel Universe are very, very different, right? Vibranium in the Marvel Universe is strong, but it's not that strong. Like, the big thing is that it doesn't vibrate. So you can hit it really hard and it doesn't shatter itself into resonant pieces. But it also makes it kind of brittle and blah, blah, right? So Captain America's shield is vibranium. It's one of the few vibranium things in the MCU. But most of the stuff that we see in the MCU made out of vibranium is actually adamantium. But because adamantium was owned by Sony, they couldn't use that. So they just made everything vibranium.
I want to hear the sixth thing, but before you talk about that, you mentioned adamantium, and I'm thinking, like, Wolverine is a cool, liminal figure because he's kind of a cyborg and he's a, like a mutant, right? He's a mutant because of the super healing and the claws, but he's a cyborg because the adamantium is added to him by the Project X.
Yeah, and it's an interesting distinction too, because like there would be, and I would be one of them, people who would say that he's not a cyborg, right? His augmentation isn't mechanical; it's material, right?
Okay.
So his adamantium skeleton is no different than, say, Killer Croc's scales.
Okay.
It's an augmentation, sure, but there's no mechanical element to it. There's nothing about that. But there are people that would argue against that, and it's an interesting conversation to have.
It's a fun conversation to have.
It can be, right? Especially so. I'm probably like one of the world's biggest Wolverine haters. But,
oh, really?
Yeah, it was just because I came into comics around the era where there was no Wolverine, and then suddenly there was Wolverine and everything.
Yeah.
Right? It was like Twilight, like he just took over the fan world, and everything's Wolverine. But he's an asshole. Like the whole problem with his juxtaposition as a short-term foil to Summers' super moralism was supposed to be very tightly focused. Here's a guy that's technically a good guy. He's just not super moral, right? We see this with Superman too. Superman, yeah, he's got a cigar. He cusses. He's not afraid of killing somebody. Like he's an anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to steal everybody's girl.
Yeah.
So it's like, I hate him. But anyway, there's other people that love him. So more power to him.
What's the sixth?
So the sixth one is training or awakening, I guess is probably a better way of putting it. So these are your Hawkeyes, right? Hawkeye, and to a certain extent, you could almost say that Strange fits within the genre, which just took us a while to get to this point, which is why I had it as last, but took a little too long. So I won't go too much into it, but I do think
this is really fascinating.
I think with training that awakens an ability beyond the normal scope of humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to fully understand and manipulate magical energy in the span of months, I think is an awakening, right? Yes, it is a learned skill, and all this, like he took training, like he specifically says, training and practice, right? Mm-hmm. It's a big deal, right? Same with Hawkeye. His entire childhood was spent on this island doing nothing but shooting stuff with a bow and arrow. So, Arrow, same kind of thing, or Green Arrow, like all these characters that have this unique skill that is beyond the scale of normal humans, but isn't literally a superpower, right?
I wonder, because there are like savants in real life who, no one compares to them. Like there's like, there's the top performers in this sport or this skill or this thing, but then the savant is like so above everyone else. It's like,
I think it's an interesting conversation to have, right? Because with savants, the training isn't the thing that awakens.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's natural.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now we might say that for these superpowered characters like Hawkeye and whatnot, they are savants, but they were savants that had to be awakened to their savantism, right? I think that's interesting. I don't think I would want to go there. I think that
it happens in basketball. It happens in basketball. There are, in terms of statistics, there are players like Michael Jordan who are like statistical deviations. Like their ability to play the game and like it's just like it's if you're just looking at numbers, it's like this is unreal. Like how does this person do what they do? You know what I mean? Right. But I feel like but in sports like golf, like I don't want to turn this into even though I'm wearing a football, I don't want to turn into a sports ball conversation, but I think there are other kind of arenas of human endeavor where there are statistical outliers who are just beyond in this almost inexplicable way.
Right, but we don't in a superpowered conversation or in a story or something like that where we have superpowers. You don't have to explain the savantism, right? Because usually, in almost all cases, a savant loses something in order to become that savant, right?
That's a good point.
So, like natural savants, especially intellectual savants, tend to have problems with social skills. Physical savants tend to have problems with things like attention or other kinds of
they're neuroatypical, basically.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't even go so far as that. Like generally, yes, all savants are like not neurotypical, but I
to
think
the
with
extent that their brain or their nervous system is connected to their ability, they have atypical brains. You know what I mean?
right, but it isn't related to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Like the brain is involved, but it's not like Michael Jordan doesn't decide that he was going to be really good at basketball,
Mm-hmm.
right? Would we say that Bobby Fischer decided he was going to be really good at chess?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. I mean, he trained a lot.
Yeah, I bet a lot of these people that were about the list would be like, yes, I worked my ass off to get to this level of skill, but and maybe that's a healthy way of thinking about it, because in terms of education, like it's a poisonous idea to think that there are people who have you should never tell a student you have a talent for this and you don't have a talent for that. That's like a no in education, because
Right.
like you can really but I do think, with that said, there are outliers. But I think the conversation about how does it apply to this archetype in superhero comics and in movies, I think that's interesting.
I do think that you're onto something, though. I think
Mhm.
calling it savantism as this next level of power, not because savantism isn't a real thing, but because the savants in superpower genre or magical genre type stories,
Mhm.
their outlierness is way the hell out there, right?
Yeah.
A savant at chess still has to learn chess,
Mhm.
whereas a superpowered savant at chess can now suddenly apply super strategy to everything in their life because they played a couple games of chess. So there's like these kind of add-ons without the subtraction that a savant normally would have. The neuroatypicality.
What are some other characters, not just superheroes, who like they're known for this skill, and they're just like born to it. Like I'm thinking like something as silly as like Paul Bunyan and lumberjacking. You know what I mean? Like
Sherlock Holmes.
they're defined by this. Sherlock Holmes. Well, that's interesting, because I think Sherlock Holmes. I don't know enough about Sherlock Holmes, but he's really interested in. It does say that he has like a one. I remember a couple of the stories where he just has a one-track mind. He's only interested in reading about things that will help him solve crimes. You know what I mean? So you think like criminal investigation seems to be a his major thing. But I was like, he has just a general ability for pattern recognition would be like the response to that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious how you like. What is it that you're looking for if that doesn't count?
Well, like where so that character who like walks up to a you know uh a bow and arrow and picks it up, and it's like, oh, my entire life has been leading up to this moment, and when they go to shoot the bow, it's like it's bullseye, right? Like clearly, like it's almost like there's an element of fate to this character's trope, right? Like it's like everything was leading up to them discovering that thing that they're good at, like
And you don't think that that's something that would apply to a Sherlock Holmes style character?
well, it's weird because I haven't read all the stories, but is there like a Sherlock Holmes origin story that talks about like how he came to become the greatest criminal investigator? Because it doesn't seem like it's part of it.
Sort of, but no, it's not a part of it because it's not that kind of a story.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need an origin story for Sherlock Holmes. You need cases for him to solve, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like the fact that he has been solving cases is the same as studying, right? In the same way that if I pick up a bow and arrow for the first time and I get the bullseye, that still kind of counts as practice, right? And like every time I hit a bullseye after that, it's going to still be practice. So you wouldn't say that somebody who's been shooting a bow and arrow for 10 years hasn't been practicing, even though they hit the bullseye the very first time. So
that. I'm sorry.
Sherlock Holmes solved his very first case.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that the 20th case that he solved is now like ho hum because he's been solving cases all this time and reading all these books and doing all this other stuff.
Well, like still, to use your use the term awakening, right? And like I feel like there's this magical moment of awakening where the character becomes themselves through like like I'm thinking like I'm reaching for examples here, like that magical moment in Forrest Gump where he takes the ping pong paddle and he just
Mhm.
starts hitting it, like, and he's really good at it from the beginning. And then like the next couple of scenes, he's like doing the crazy, like I think that's with these characters. That's like, it seems like that moment of like that magical moment of like they've reached that point where they're going to become who they were supposed to come. It seems like it's part of this type of power. It's like,
Yeah,
they have to kind of find their way to their calling, their calling or their awakening or whatever.
but I don't think that has to be part of your story at the outset, right? Like maybe later on, like for instance, the first story about James Bond, who I would count, like I would include James Bond with all these others in the fact that like he is a super spy, like capital S.
Casino Royale is the first novel, but it's not an origin story. It's like,
Yeah,
like what
right.
you said, he's just a super spy. He's actually not even that
It's
super of a spy in there in that one. He's kind of just a normal spy.
but that's just it. What is it that defines a super spy versus just a normal spy? Like the fact that he lives, the fact that he always gets like he always succeeds. Like, what makes a super spy? Like it wouldn't be very interesting to listen to read a story about a super spy that you never see because they're never seen. Like that's their super spy. I mean, that's kind of boring. We want a super spy that is super suave and is able to do all these things right in front of the villains' faces and like come out on top and still kind of win the day. Hercules, the dude from the
For some reason, the way you pronounce Hercules, it made me think of the Nutty Professor. I'm sorry, completely.
Hercules. The guy from the Murder on the Orient Express and all those stories.
Oh, I forget his name. It's a French name.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that most recent adaptation, and I haven't read any. I've never read any Agatha Christie, by the way. It's a big hole in my.
I think mysteries are a good place to find the kinds of characters that we're talking about here, because the ability to find mystery to solve the mystery requires not just intelligence, right? Like you said, pattern recognition.
I swear I'm not trying to turn this into a sports ball conversation, but like it seems like it's part of like sports mythology, like the movie The Natural with Robert Redford. Like it's literally The Natural. Like when he starts playing baseball, it's like he was fated to play this game. Like, and I think that you could. Doctor Strange is kind of like The Natural, but with occult magic and stuff. It's like
Absolutely.
he just yeah.
I think the only difference between some of these older references and like your sports ball stuff is that for most of them we don't get an origin story because we don't need them, right? We want to get into the mystery. That's what it's all about. The origin story has no mystery to it. There's no fun there. You might hear, a discussion about, Watson's time in the war, but we don't care enough about Watson's time in the war to actually read a book about Watson's time in the war. We want that to just be a little sideline, a couple paragraphs in the middle of the mystery. Whereas with sports ball, it's all about the origin story. Any kind of physical adept of that kind, I think the origin story is what matters because there are so many people that are good at those kinds of things. Like there's not that many people that are capable of what Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie's Hercules or Encyclopedia Brown or like any of these kinds of characters. There's not that many people that can do that. But there's lots of people that can play basketball. But what's important is that these guys were able to come into the game playing basketball at the level of these people who've been practicing their whole lives. And that is interesting because that is our Hawkeye, right? Or Hawkeye's probably not the best example, but there are martial artists and whatnot. Martial artists are a good example because they actually pop up in superhero fiction a lot more than other countries. Like, yeah, there are football players that become superheroes, but they're not very interesting.
Now I'm just like this concept of like the superpower as like an awakening, like almost like a talent, like this like
Mhm.
that's like I like that you've set it off as like the sixth thing, like it's a sixth kind of superpower. It's like there's this person that has this talent or this innate skill that they're fated to connect to, and then they like, it I don't know, it's intriguing. We didn't really get. I think we should do another episode on Doctor Strange. By the way, I think that we haven't talked about the tension between mysticism and science enough. Like I wanted to talk to you about Plato's allegory of the cave, and like, like what is the difference between magic and casting a magical spell versus you know I'm trying like engineering a ray gun and shooting a ray gun, like, or how about this, gloves that shoot lasers out of their hands, like how is that different than like a magic missile spell from Dungeons and Dragons? I think that's what
Yeah.
we should, if you're amenable to it, we should do another one on this topic,
Yeah.
because I don't think we've really scratched the surface.
We said we were going to do that on RoboCop 2, but we didn't.
Oh, we didn't. Oh, we need to go back and do another. I got to watch the RoboCop one. But now that we're we'll maybe draw this to a conclusion. So our plan is to do this more regularly. Like we're going to do this next Thursday, right?
Yeah,
so
sounds good.
I'll keep this part in so that if people watch this, then they can get all riled up, ready to watch the next one.
Cool.
But yeah. So I think that's about it. I think we're at how should we conclude this? Will you conclude by going through your six, just kind of giving us the names, because I think that's a really useful thing to take away from this.
Sure. So we'll go with magic as a skill,
Mm-hmm.
then channeling as a power source. And both of those would kind of meet together, but I don't think that they are close enough. Like we talked about with super science and weird science, I don't think they're close enough to count as the same exact thing. So magic, channeling, psionics, superpowers, super science, weird science, and then awakening, or savantism, awakened savantism. Okay. I really like that. I'm gonna keep it.
And so it looks like maybe Doctor Strange would be a mixture of the awakening and the magic, maybe even the channeling, because there's moments where he's doing channeling as well. But there's clearly no superpowers there. There's he's not engaged in it. Well, he was a surgeon, but he's his surgeon abilities, like his medical knowledge, doesn't play into the character after he becomes Doctor Strange. So I don't know. I think that's useful. I think it's intriguing. So,
cool.
All right.
Yeah. So I guess we conclude with to be continued.
To be continued. Okay.